There is a unique quality to the memories of a Saturday morning cartoon. They exist in a haze of brightly colored nostalgia, of simple heroes and even simpler villains. They are artifacts of a time before the world felt complicated. But what if one of those artifacts was never simple at all? What if, hidden beneath the veneer of adventure, was a story of profound darkness? In 1991, at the zenith of this animated golden age, the legendary studio Hanna-Barbera, the house that Yogi Bear and Fred Flintstone built, decided to gamble. They set out to create a series so ambitious, so epic in scope, it was meant to rival The Lord of the Rings on Saturday mornings. It was a story of planetary genocide, of ancient, reality-bending magic, and of a cosmic horror disguised as a children's cartoon. But just as it reached its most critical, world-defining point, it vanished, leaving behind one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in animation history. This is the story of what we weren't meant to see: a dying world, Mare, being devoured by a living, sentient ocean called the Dark Water. A young prince, Ren, thrust into a desperate quest not for glory, but for survival. A crew of broken heroes, a cynical pirate, an outcast magic user, and a flying monkey bird. And the 13 treasures of rule, artifacts of immense power said to be the only hope for stopping the unstoppable tide. For 21 episodes, audiences were captivated by this sprawling, serialized epic. Then, silence. The story was left unfinished, the world left to die. For decades, the true ending has been the subject of rumor and speculation, but the truth is not lost. It was simply buried. Using lost interviews with the show's creators, examining pages from the Marvel Comics adaptation that continued the story, and piecing together details from the original series Bible, we can now reconstruct the show's intended finale. So, what really was the Dark Water? What were the final, unfound treasures of rule? And how was Prince Ren's quest truly supposed to end? To understand what was lost, we must first appreciate what was built. The world of Myr was unlike anything else on television in 1991. It was not a collection of static backdrops for weekly adventures. It was a character in and of itself, and it was dying. Every episode was steeped in a palpable sense of dread and decay. This wasn't a world you saved at the end of a 22-minute runtime. This was a world actively perishing before our eyes. Myr was a water planet of impossible geography. Islands floated in the sky, cities were built on the backs of giant sea creatures, and its people were a tapestry of strange and varied races. At the heart of this world was the kingdom of Octopon, a beacon of civilization ruled by King Primus. His son, Ren, was a seemingly ordinary lighthouse keeper, unaware of his royal lineage. His life is shattered when his father, on the run and mortally wounded, entrusts him with the first 2 treasures of rule and the desperate mission to find the other 11. The quest structure was the engine of the series, a clear goal that propelled the narrative forward. 13 treasures, scattered across a hostile world, were needed to push back the encroaching Dark Water. But from the very beginning, the show's creative leads, producer David Kirshner and head writer Glenn Leopold, imbued the series with a maturity that set it apart. Kirshner, known for his work on the decidedly dark An American Tail and the Child's Play horror franchise, ensured the stakes felt real. In a 1992 interview with Comic Scene magazine, Kirshner stated his goal was to create a motion picture for television, a serialized story where actions had consequences, and they did. Characters who died stayed dead, betrayals left scars, victories were almost always Pyrrhic, coming at a great cost. Ren wasn't a muscle-bound Superman. He was an uncertain teenager, frequently out of his depth, who had to rely on a crew that was anything but heroic. Oz, the cynical pirate captain, was initially only in it for the promise of treasure. He was greedy, selfish, and pragmatic to a fault, a stark contrast to Ren's idealism. Tula, an ecomancer, was a powerful magic user with the ability to control and commune with nature, but her powers made her an outcast, feared by her own people for being different. And then there was Niddler, the flying monkey bird, providing comic relief but also a surprising amount of heart, often serving as the crew's moral compass. Together, aboard Ioz's ship, the Wraith, they were pursued relentlessly by the series' primary antagonist, Lord Bloth. Bloth wasn't a bumbling fool. He was a hulking, intelligent, and ruthlessly effective pirate captain commanding a massive warship, the Maelstrom. He didn't just want the treasures for power. He seemed to revel in the slow, agonizing death of the world, seeing it as an opportunity to carve out his own empire from the ruins. This combination, a dying world, a desperate quest, flawed heroes, and a terrifying villain, created a feedback loop of tension. The serialized nature meant you couldn't miss an episode. The show aired its first 5 episodes as a miniseries in February 1991, with a full series order following that fall. But behind the scenes, the ambition that made the show great was also planting the seeds of its demise. The animation was complex and fluid, the color palette was rich and cinematic, and the orchestral score was sweeping. All of this was incredibly expensive, far more so than a typical Hanna-Barbera production. For 21 episodes, the studio footed the bill and the saga of Mare unfolded. 8 of the 13 treasures were found, and then in 1993 it was over. No finale, no resolution, just an empty space in the Saturday morning lineup. The prevailing theory has always been its high cost, but the story is more complex. The true reason it vanished is tied directly to the dark places the story was about to go. To understand that, we have to look past the heroes and into the heart of their enemy, the black consuming sea itself. What was the dark water? On the surface, it's presented as a malevolent substance, a kind of magical pollution. It devours everything it touches: land, ships, people, leaving behind only a dead, black sludge. Its touch corrupts, creating monstrous versions of once living creatures, the Dark Dwellers. But this is a deliberately simplistic explanation for a children's audience. The evidence left behind by the creative team paints a picture of something far more horrifying. The first clue is in its behavior. The dark water isn't a mindless force, it's intelligent. It actively hunts. In the episode The Dark Dweller, it forms tentacles to drag ships down. It creates whirlpools to trap its prey. It is a predator. The show's series Bible, portions of which have been shared by production staff over the years, elaborates on this. It describes the dark water not as a liquid, but as the physical manifestation of a single, ancient consciousness. This entity was not native to Mur. It was an alien intelligence that arrived, or was perhaps imprisoned within the planet, eons ago. Its goal was not merely destruction, but consumption and absorption. It didn't just want to kill Mur, it wanted to become Mur. Every island it swallowed, every creature it corrupted, was another piece of the world added to its own consciousness. It was, for all intents and purposes, a planetary-scale cancer, a malevolent god being slowly digesting a world from the inside out. This entity was given a name in the production documents, the Dark Dweller. While a creature called the Dark Dweller appears in the episode of the same name, that was merely one of its more powerful minions. The true Dark Dweller was the intelligence behind the water. Loth believed he could control the dark water. He was wrong. He was a pawn. The Dark Dweller was intelligent enough to use the Pirate Lord's greed and ambition as a tool to accelerate its own consumption of the world. It allowed Bloth to think he was in charge, all while he was simply spreading the cancer faster. The Marvel Comics adaptation, written by Glenn Leopold himself, was able to explore this lore more directly. In the comics, the psychic connection between the Dark Dweller and its servants is made explicit. It could communicate, promise power, and drive its followers to madness. This established a terrifying precedent. The ultimate villain of the series was not a person who could be fought with a sword. It was the very ocean beneath their ship. How do you kill a planet-sized monster that has already won? The answer lies in the true purpose of the treasures. They were not weapons. They were keys. The official premise describes the 13 treasures of rule as being able to push back the dark water. This is true, but it's a profound understatement of their function. They were not simply magical trinkets. According to the original pitch documents from David Kirshner, the treasures were the literal building blocks of Mir's reality. They were tools used by the planet's original architects to stabilize and give form to the world's life-giving energy. Collecting them wasn't just about cleaning up a mess, it was about rebooting the planet's operating system. Over 21 episodes, Ren and his crew managed to secure 8 of the 13 treasures. Each one demonstrated a specific godlike power that reinforces this keys to reality concept. The first treasure, the compass, pointed the way to the others. The second, the crystal, created a protective energy shield. The third, from the episode Break Up, could generate concussive blasts of force. The fourth, the Star of Stars, could amplify energy and act as a power source. The fifth, the Gem of the Leviathan, allowed control over the titanic sea beast it was found on. The sixth, The orb of the elements granted control over wind and water. The seventh, the dragon's maw, could project a beam of pure heat. And the eighth treasure, the bell of the first chime, could create sonic vibrations capable of shattering stone. Individually, they are powerful. Together, they form a symphony of creation. But it is the 5 unfound treasures that reveal the true, terrifying scope of their power and the moral compromises the writers had planned for our heroes. While their exact forms were never finalized for animation, their functions were laid out by the writing staff, and some were even explored in the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo video games, which were developed with input from the show's creators. The 9th treasure was known as the Amulet of the Ecomancer. This was meant to be the centerpiece of a major arc for Tula. The amulet didn't just control nature, it could rewrite the life force of a living being. It could heal any wound, cure any disease, but also held the power to unnaturally accelerate growth or decay. According to writer Glenn Leopold in a fan Q&A from the late 90s, the plan was for Tula to be tempted to use it to cure herself of the powers that made her an outcast, but doing so would have severed her connection to Mare, making her unable to help in the final battle. It was a choice between her personal happiness and her planetary duty. The 10th treasure was the Tear of the Alchemist. This artifact was a liquid jewel with the power of transmutation. It could turn lead to gold, but more importantly, it could purify any substance. The moral quandary here was immediately obvious. A single drop could purify a patch of dark water, turning it back into clean ocean. Why not just use it to solve the problem? Because its power was finite. Using it to purify small patches of the ocean would be like using an eyedropper to empty a lake. The crew would have been forced to make impossible choices. Save this village's water supply or save that city's fishing grounds. It was a treasure that offered infinite hope but demanded impossible triage. The true challenge wasn't finding it, it was the burden of deciding who gets to live and who is left to the rot. The 11th treasure is perhaps the most fascinating, the Rune of the Wraith. This was not an object to be found, but a power to be unlocked. The treasure was the ship itself, the Wraith. In a planned mid-season finale, the crew would discover that Ios's ship was built from the wood of a sentient, ancient tree that was itself a planetary defense mechanism. The rune was a series of symbols carved into its keel that, when activated by the combined power of the other treasures, would have allowed the ship to phase out of reality, making it completely intangible and able to travel through solid matter, or even, for short periods, through the dark water itself without being consumed. This would have been their key to reaching the final battleground. The 12th treasure was the Claw of the Dragon. This artifact was intended to be the show's ultimate offensive weapon. While the dragon's maw could project heat, the claw was far more sinister. It was a gauntlet that could rip holes in the fabric of space-time. It didn't just move you from one place to another, it created temporary, unstable wormholes. The danger was immense. A miscalculation could open a portal into the heart of a star or into the vacuum of space. The writers planned for it to be located in a highly unstable region of Mare, a graveyard of dimensions where reality was already weak. Retrieving it would have been a mind-bending, reality-warping journey that would have tested the sanity of the entire crew. And that brings us to the final, 13th treasure of Rule, the heart of the founder. This was not a jewel or a weapon, it was a living being. Production notes suggest that the founder was the original architect of Mare, an ancient, godlike entity who, after creating the world and seeding it with life, went into a deep slumber at the planet's core. The heart was not literally their heart, but a descendant, a being who carried the original spark of creation. The ultimate shock was meant to be the identity of this 13th treasure. The show had been dropping clues all along, a character who was always kind, who instinctively understood the balance of nature, who was an orphan with no known history, and who was the moral center of a broken crew. The 13th treasure of Rule was Niddler. The final piece of the puzzle needed to restore the world was the life force of Ren's closest and most innocent friend. This hard-to-say fact was the linchpin of the entire Unwritten saga. The ultimate victory could only be achieved through the ultimate sacrifice. And this horrifying revelation was designed to shatter the crew from within, leading to the story's darkest chapters. The discovery of Niddler's true nature as the final treasure was intended to be the inciting incident for the show's final act. It would have completely upended the group's dynamic and forced every character to confront their deepest flaws. This is where the planned character arcs hinted at throughout the series would have come to tragic fruition. For Ayaz, the pirate who lived by a code of self-preservation and profit, the moral calculus would have been brutal. Throughout the series, he slowly, almost imperceptibly, grew to care for the crew. He evolved from their jailer to their captain, but the writers never intended to let him off the hook that easily. The reveal would have put his two driving motivations in direct conflict: unimaginable wealth versus his burgeoning loyalty. The collected treasures of Rule represented the greatest pirate haul in the history of Mer. With them, he could be a king. All he had to do was turn his back on Ren and sacrifice the creature he'd mockingly called Monkey Bird. According to Glenn Leopold, Ayaz's planned arc was one of temptation and betrayal. He would have temporarily sided with Bloth, or a new faction, believing he could seize the treasures for himself once the Dark Water was dealt with. He would rationalize that sacrificing Niddler was the logical choice, the pragmatic choice to save billions of lives. It would have been a heartbreaking betrayal, casting one of the show's core heroes as a temporary antagonist, driven by the very greed that defined him in the first episode. His redemption would have been hard-won, likely coming only after he realized the hollowness of a victory achieved through such a cold-blooded sacrifice. Tula's journey was meant to be one of escalating power and terrifying consequences. Her connection to the Ek of Mar, its life force, made her uniquely sensitive to the planet's pain. As the dark water spread, she felt every island that died, every creature that was corrupted. The writers planned for her powers to grow exponentially as more treasures were collected, as they amplified her innate abilities. But this power came at a physical and mental cost. Concept art for the unproduced episodes shows a Tula who looks less human, with skin taking on a bark-like texture and vines subtly growing from her hair. She was literally, physically becoming one with the planet. The discovery of Niddler as the final treasure would have presented her with an unbearable choice. As an ecomancer, she understood the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good of the ecosystem. She would have been the one character to argue in favor of using Niddler to save the planet, seeing it as a tragic but necessary part of nature's cycle. This would have put her in direct opposition to Ren, creating a deep philosophical and emotional rift in the crew. She would have become a well-intentioned extremist, her connection to the suffering planet overriding her connection to her friends. And then there is Ren. His entire quest was predicated on the idea that he could be the perfect hero, that he could save everyone. The Niddler revelation was designed to destroy that notion completely. It would have reframed his entire journey as a march toward the execution of his friend. This was the point where Bloth would have ceased to be the true threat. The true enemy was the impossible choice in front of them. Bloth himself was also slated for a major change. He wasn't meant to be the final boss. His obsession with the treasures and his proximity to the Dark Water would have led to his undoing. The plan was for him to be consumed and assimilated by the Dark Dweller, becoming its ultimate general, a grotesque, superpowered monstrosity, his original body twisted and fused with dark water. He would become a physical avatar for the planetary intelligence, a final, horrifying obstacle before the heroes could confront the entity itself. So, the stage was set for the Unwritten finale. The crew is broken, with Ayaz having betrayed them for wealth and Tula advocating for the sacrifice of their friend. Ren is paralyzed by an impossible choice. And the entity known as the Dark Dweller, wearing the face of their old enemy Bloth, is finally ready to consume what's left of the world. Piecing together the intended climax requires synthesizing all the available evidence. Leopold's statements about the bittersweet ending, Kirshner's love for dark, fairy tale-like consequences, and the narrative threads from the comics and video games. The final battle was not meant to take place on the sea, but at the very heart of Mar. Using the unlocked power of the Wraith, Ren and the fractured remains of his crew would journey to the planet's core, the prison or nexus of the Dark Dweller. Here, they would confront the Bloth amalgamation, a battle that would push their powers and the ship's capabilities to their absolute limit. But the physical fight was just a prelude to the real climax. The ultimate confrontation would be with the Dark Dweller's consciousness itself. Ren would have to use the treasures not as weapons, but as instruments. The plan was for him to channel their collective power to create a resonance cascade, a chime. that would reverberate through the very fabric of Mor. This is where the bell of the first chime, the eighth treasure found, becomes critical. It was the key to amplifying and broadcasting the harmonic energy of the other 12. But to complete the circuit, to create the perfect frequency that could separate the Dark Dweller's consciousness from the planet's lifeblood, the final note in the symphony was required. The life force of the 13th treasure, Niddler. Here lies the monkey's paw, ending that the creators always intended. Ren would refuse. He would not be able to sacrifice his friend, even to save the world. It is the defining choice of his character, choosing love and loyalty over cold, utilitarian logic. In that moment of defiance, Eoz, having seen the true horror of the Dark Dweller and the emptiness of his greed, was meant to return, sacrificing himself to save Ren and cripple the Bloth creature, a final act of redemption. But the problem of the 13th treasure would remain. The solution, according to the writer's plans, was as poetic as it was tragic. Seeing Ren's refusal, Niddler would make the choice himself. He would willingly offer his life force, not as a sacrifice, but as a gift. In the show's most heartbreaking sequence, he would touch the central apparatus, completing the circuit and unleashing a wave of pure, creative energy across the planet. The dark water would be purged. The Dark Dweller's consciousness would be severed from the physical world, not killed, but banished to a non-physical plane, forever unable to touch Mur again. The world would be saved. Ren would be victorious, but he would have lost the most innocent part of his world in the process. The series was intended to end with a shot of Ren, Tula, and the crew of the Wraith standing on a green, vibrant shore, the world saved, but with a profound and permanent silence where Niddler's cheerful chatter used to be. The victory would feel like a defeat. It was a mature, somber, and deeply resonant ending, one that would have stuck with its young audience for a lifetime. And it was almost certainly one of the reasons the show was never allowed to finish. The official reason for the Pirates of Dark Water's cancellation is simple economics. The show's budget was astronomical for the time, reportedly over $500,000 per episode. The detailed animation, cinematic score, and lack of recycled footage made it a financial black hole. Furthermore, a planned toy line from Hasbro, which was expected to offset the costs, failed to get off the ground and was canceled before it even hit shelves. With no merchandising revenue and sky-high production costs, the plug was pulled. But that is a corporate story. The creative story is that the show was getting darker, more complex, and was heading toward a conclusion that was perhaps deemed too intense for its target demographic. The planned themes of betrayal, moral compromise, and the noble sacrifice of a beloved character were heady stuff for a Saturday morning slot sandwiched between lighter fare. The show was a creative masterpiece, but it was also a commercial anomaly. It was too serialized for casual viewers to jump into, too dark for some parents, and too expensive to justify its niche appeal. It was a victim of its own towering ambition. The legacy of the Pirates of Dark Water is one of what if. It remains a cult classic, beloved by those who remember its brief, brilliant voyage. It pushed the boundaries of televised animation in the West, paving the way for other serialized action cartoons like Avatar, The Last Airbender, and Gargoyles. It proved that a young audience was hungry for complex characters and season-long arcs. Its DNA is present in much of the great television that followed, but the original story remains a ghost, a tantalizingly incomplete saga. The story of the Pirates of Dark Water is a map with a missing piece. Thanks to the breadcrumbs left behind by its creators, we have the evidence of where the journey was going, the trials the heroes would have faced, and the terrible price of their victory. But the destination itself will forever be an echo, an unfilmed scene in the collective imagination of its fans. It forces us to ask a difficult question. The creators intended to give us a powerful story about loss and the painful nature of sacrifice. A story that taught that even in a total victory, you can still lose something irreplaceable. Knowing the true, tragic cost that was planned for Ren and his friends, was it better that we never saw it? that we were left with a story of unending hope rather than one of heartbreaking success? What do you think would have been the ultimate fate of a world saved by such a dark bargain? And what other unfinished stories from that era still haunt the halls of animation history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.